my name's Tim, and I have Parkinson's disease. And as you can see, I'm also in bed right now. I've been having a little bout with orthostatic hypotension. My blood pressure is like 2/1. Well, not that bad, but it's pretty low. So I'll go ahead and start it here. And what I'm going to do first is say I am not a doctor. I've never been in the medical field at all. I'm just an old retired person with Parkinson's, and I'm interested in Parkinson's disease. I'm learning as much as I can about it. In my last video about Vyalev, when I was taking Vyalev, I had mentioned, I think I'll talk about the journey of the medication from the cannula to the brain, from the infusion site to the brain. All I've been talking about so far is just my journey with Parkinson's. So I thought, okay, I'll put together one with the medication's journey through my body. Vyalev's medication journey, foscarbidopa, foslevodopa, it all begins at the cannula, where there is a continuous infusion of the medication. Well, the last 5 videos that I made about Vyalev is talking about my journey with Parkinson's. Now I'm going to talk about foslevodopa on its journey from the infusion site all the way into the brain. The foscarbidopa journey is very similar to the foslevodopa, so I'm just going to talk about the foslevodopa and its journey. The thing that's a little bit different, once you get to the blood-brain barrier, carbidopa is rejected. Now, what we have here is a representation showing the infusion site. So in the middle, you see the blue, what looks like a liquid, that would be the medication. And in the middle, where it looks like a needle, that's the cannula, which is a soft tubing, which is usually about 6 millimeters. The hypodermis is variable in thickness, so a patient may need a cannula that's 9 millimeters rather than 6. Now, within the hypodermis, we have the veins, the arteries, the nerves, the lymphatic, and the blood capillaries. Now, I've heard some people say capillaries, but I call it capillaries. The blood capillaries will not let just anything in. If the molecule size of the protein or whatever is wanting to get into the blood capillaries too big, well, it'll probably end up in the lymphatic capillaries instead. If my memory serves me right, the molecule for foslevodopa is 277.17 Daltons, where a Dalton is equivalent to 1/12 of the mass of a neutral carbon-12 atom, while the foslevodopa molecule is small enough to get into the capillaries. Once we get into the blood-brain barrier, it's not going to make it without a little bit of help. Okay, now the medication is in the capillaries and it's on its way. Now, we're going to talk about 3 different types of capillaries. The continuous is the first one we're going to look at. And it just so happens, this is the capillary type that's at the skin and at the brain level. Starting at the far right, you can see the size of this capillary is only big enough to allow the size of a red blood cell to go through, so it's pretty small. It's composed of only a thin wall of endothelial cells, so the thickness is 1 cell thick. Since the walls of the capillaries are so thin, it allows for easy diffusion of oxygen, carbon dioxide, nutrients, and waste products. You can also see very small pores. So the continuous type capillary is the least leaky. It allows small molecules, water, ions. And then we have the parasites. They're a multifunctional cell that are wrapped around the capillaries and are responsible for the tight junction formation of the endothelial cells. Next, we have the fenestrated capillary. Now, we've already talked about all of these little piece parts, but what I want to mention here with this particular capillary, it's moderately leaky. It allows higher volumes of fluids and larger molecules to pass through. This type of capillary is found in areas requiring fast exchange, such as kidneys, small intestines. And then last, we have the sinusoidal capillaries. That's the highest permeability. The endothelial cells have largest gaps, which allows large substances like, large proteins to pass. You would find this type of capillary in the liver, the spleen, bone marrow, and the lymphoid organs. The medication now is on its way in the bloodstream. If you were taking Cinnamate rather than the infusion, you would have had to have first go through the stomach, get into the small intestines, through the small intestines, into the bloodstream. And you could be fighting it out with proteins, which was made from the breakfast that you just ate. Some of what could be in the bloodstream, as I just said, your breakfast. Maybe you just had breakfast. So the proteins that come from the breakfast would be in the bloodstream, along with levodopa, which comes from the foslevodopa after the conversion. And we'll see how that works in a little bit. The process of converting the foslevodopa into the levodopa uses an enzyme which the body makes, which is called alkaline phosphatase. Now, when you go to your doctor and you have some blood work done, one of the tests they do is comprehensive metabolic panel. In that test, they test a lot of things like your calcium, your sodium, alkaline phosphatase. What you're seeing on this chart is my results for alkaline phosphatase. You can see it looks like everything's great up until that spike. And where you see that spike, I just had surgery. That's why it was so high. The reason I'm showing this is when the prodrugs, foslevodopa and foscarbidopa, are infused subcutaneously, they're converted into the active forms of levodopa and carbidopa. Alkaline phosphatase is found throughout the body, including the blood and the liver. These are enzymes that perform the dephosphorylation reaction. Concerns with using the enzyme alkaline phosphatase to convert the prodrugs in Vyalev, the foslevodopa, foscarbidopa, it centers around the potential variability on the patient's natural enzyme levels. A patient with hypophosphatasia may not be the best candidate. Here is a two-dimensional chemical structure for the enzyme alkaline phosphatase, which is also called carboxylesterase, which is present in the blood, and this is what cleaves the phosphate group that you see in the lower left-hand corner. To remove a phosphate group from a molecule, you typically use hydrolysis. A water molecule, H2O, is used to break the bond. One part of the water, an ion OH negative, attaches to the phosphate group, and the other part, hydrogen positive ion, attaches to the remaining molecule. And what we have here is levodopa. This will pass through the blood-brain barrier, and it's the precursor to dopamine. Okay, we're on our way to the brain. Now, we will pass through the heart, go over to the lungs, get oxygenated, go back through the heart, and then head towards the brain. Arterial supply to the brain comes from two paired arteries, the internal carotid and the vertebral arteries. The issue we have with Parkinson's is that the substantia nigra, a subcortical nuclei of the basal ganglia, is not producing the dopamine that we need. Levodopa is a precursor of dopamine. Now, since dopamine cannot cross the blood-brain barrier and levodopa can, we need to get as much levodopa into the brain as we can. First of all, we can see in this drawing that both the periphery and the brain has many of the same proteins, enzymes, inhibitors as the periphery. Just below the 3-O-methyl-dopa, or 3-OMD, we see catechol-O-methyltransferase, or COMT. Along with my carbidopa-levodopa medication, I take entacapone, a COMT inhibitor. So more levodopa can cross the blood-brain barrier. Aromatic L-amino acid decarbolase, or AADC, is present throughout the periphery, which converts levodopa to dopamine. Now, remember, dopamine cannot cross the blood-brain barrier. So carbidopa blocks the AADC enzyme outside of the brain, not in the brain. The blood-brain barrier. This drawing is very similar to the one we just looked at, whereas on the left we have the bloodstream, we have the barrier, and then on the right we have the brain. Now, if I were to ask you a question, the capillaries here are what? Are they continuous, sinusoidal? I know you would know that they're continuous. In fact, the blood-brain barrier is a highly selective layer of endothelial cells that forms a protective shield around the brain. Levodopa can cross the blood-brain barrier. However, the way it does it, it needs to use a transporter. In this picture, you can see different types of transporters, one direction, both directions. Levodopa uses large neutral amino acid transporter, LAT1. However, the LAT1 transports many different proteins across the barrier into the brain. Oh man, there's my breakfast. Oh, okay, now we're in competition with LAT1. Is it going to take, oh, LAT1 just took my breakfast protein across the barrier. That's okay. Levodopa won't make it there. Now we're into the extracellular space. Extracellular space, that's the immediate external environment of brain cells. The extracellular space contains a fluid similar in composition to that you would find in the brain ventricles that maintains the ionic balance for calcium, sodium, potassium, and chlorides across the cell membrane. The ionic balance establishes the cellular resting potential, and it permits the neuronal action potentials in the synaptic transmission. The parenchymal is the last barrier that we need to go through to get into the brain. It has selective layers of cells and tissue that regulate what passes into or out of an organ's functional tissue. Remember earlier I said that carbidopa stops the conversion of levodopa into dopamine. That was in the periphery. However, now here in the brain, we want that process to work. Aromatic L-amino acid decarbolase performs that function, which is called decarboxylation. In other words, AADC removes the carboxyl group. And there you have a medication's journey from the cannula to the brain.